kind of a long. That's good.
Yeah, Snoopy and Britches.
Snoopy and Bridges, yeah.
That was a nice little old team.
He was up there trying to sell them to a fellow there at Kingman. And, of course, Lauren was just a little guy.
Yeah.
He didn't know better. He was standing there listening to Robert's sales talk, and pretty soon Lauren pops up and says, "Yeah, and they've been."
He's gonna spring him out of there.
Don't ever get married.
Already, I'm not going to do it. Yeah, then you'll run the old.
Get up, bro.
Stand in front.
Yeah? Yeah, you can sit inside that trailer. Oh.
Right there, get behind him.
Oh, yeah.
You might not kick, but you might buck, huh?
Have you ever heard that before they left?
That's the favorite line, huh? Once you start turning that little kick, that's when you want to watch out.
Yes.
Right. How, you hooked
I think I've been dropping about 2.
What kind of horse?
We're clear on back to slide here.
Oh.
Hey, you got him?
Hi, how you doing?
Easy. too short yet. I don't know. But
Drop 2 or 3, there's one more.
well, I think maybe we'll have. I think we're going to have to. Let's see. Just drop one. And that goes in.
Oh, yeah?
All right.
Thank you, Mr. Sophia.
Around the backside of the cemetery. And kind of come down through this driveway. You know, we want to kind of keep this thing. We'll direct you over there. Put this one on this side.
That's why. Your name is Stookie. See, I'm a Gearing, and I had to park way over there in the back. What about, Ben, what about in there behind? Can we put some there?
I don't think so, because they've already brought horses around there.
Oh, they did?
Yeah, get as close as you can there.
I'll get awful hot in that car if he tries to wake me out.
Are you taking the camera?
Yep, in my umbrella.
Hello.
How are you?
Being artist?
Pardon?
Is everybody obeying the order?
No, not as good as you did, that's for sure. Your wife obeyed me perfect. See, but some are this.
Without a mic pinned on him.
Come in
There you go.
to the area here. You traveled from Illinois, is that correct?
Yeah, I was born in Newton, raised here in Moundridge, in town.
I
Member
see.
of the First Mennonite Church of Christian in Moundridge.
Okay. And just so I have it on tape, Mr. Crable, tell me your name and...
Okay, my name is James Craybill. I'm from Charleston, Illinois.
All right. You have written a book, maybe other publications about family history, about the Swiss Mennonites. Why don't you tell me about your effort? What got you started? What inspired you to do this? And what's it been like?
Well, I began by starting with an interest in my family and deciding wanted to find out who my grandparents were, great-grandparents. And I went to the Bethel College Library and ran into the Hopefield Mennonite church book, which was started in Edvardsdorf, Russia, and then was taken to Katusivka, Russia, before it was brought to this country. And I started looking through family data in that book, and just decided I needed to pull all the data out, so I transcribed the entire church book. Then I became interested in wondering if there were any other church books, and I found 2 in South Dakota. So I went there, had those duplicated, and transcribed them also. And that led to an interest in tying all these people together.
Yeah, and well, let me ask you, what is the tie?
Well, there's a very bad problem in that they kept using the same names over and over again. 6 boys' names and 6 girls' names were used about 85% of all the time. All children were named one of those 12 names, and so you're always getting tangled up with people. So I figured I had to just sit down and figure out who married whom and who their children were, and so I put them all together. So I finally straightened that all out, and that's when I published the book.
I see. What impressed you in learning about the different families? What are some things that really, I mean, it seems to me like it's something that got in your blood, so to speak, they say. And I mean, what was the appeal for you, and what impressed you about all this discovery of these families?
Well, it's just first of all, and what made it relatively easy, I think, is because they were Germans living in Russia, and so they were very self-contained. Of course, there were many, many Germans living in Russia, hundreds of thousands of them, of which the Mennonites formed just a small group. But the Mennonites within the German group stuck together also. So it was relatively simple, therefore, because it was self-contained.
And the history itself, and genealogy in particular, I mean, obviously you feel that there is some value to doing this. I mean, more than just a way to pass the time. I mean, we hope maybe our children will read about this. And what do you hope people will learn from the genealogy and from the things that you've discovered?
Well, to kind of get an impression and a sense of value of their ancestry and of their history, and what their parents, grandparents, and ancestors believed.
What about the past, about the old country people? Any lessons about the struggles that they had that are relevant to today, or is it just history for the sake of history?
No, all struggles, I guess, are relevant. I've often wondered, though, you sometimes wonder about the advisability of coming to the United States, because they had a fear of losing control of their children, I suppose, or their children spreading to and being influenced by outside influences. And one thing I've found is I've carried forward one more generation after they came to this country, as they spread all over the United States, and have lost a lot of ties and whatnot.
So that is a fear that was really realized.
It was really realized, yeah, to a great extent.
And just a final comment about your thoughts about being here at this celebration. I mean, what are your thoughts on feelings on a day like today?
Well, it's good to talk to a lot of people who know people whom you know, or whom you knew as an infant, or as a child, and whatnot. It's great.
Okay, very good. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Ich bin der Schrak Daniel. Daniel Schrak. Schrak Daniel. Und ich bin schon lange tot gewesen. Und ich viel vergessen, wie es mal war gewesen. Aber am Anfang, da kommen wir zu Kansas da, es war schwer gewesen, schwer geht. Die Grasshoppers, die waren schon weg. Aber die Russen kommen nicht erst rein. Aber das Schlimmste war, die haben alles Englisch geredet. Und ich kann nichts verstehen. So, ich kann doch ein bisschen Englisch, ja, aber wenn ich auch Deutsch rede, ja, kann das nicht verstehen. Dann habe ich meinen Großsohn, der Hans Wurst, gesagt, du komm mit mir und du redest Englisch, weil ich kann nicht gut nach. Grandpa, why don't you just go ahead? You're doing all right. No? Gut. Du fang jetzt an. Okay, Grandpa, I'll do it. I know you understand me, although you speak a little. I'm going to follow this quite a bit. I'm sorry I don't have more of these, but if any of the stones on this in this cemetery that have the Schrag name on it, it's probably from this family. Now we're going back to 1874. It was Andreas and Barbara. Now, up until about 5 minutes ago, I thought Andreas was buried in Russia. But I see a stone up here that I can't quite figure out. But anyhow, Grandma, our Grandma, is buried on, and that her gravestone is that one up there that has a little cupola on it. She was right over there someplace. Has a little thing on top. Well, anyhow, she was one of the oldest ones that came across. Now, they had 10 children. 7 boys and 3 girls. Of course, the boys were Schrags, and one of the boys married a Schrag, and 3 of the girls married Schrags. So either by birth or by accident or by marriage, most people around here would be related somehow, and so most of the stones here are Schrag stones. Now their children, they had, I guess they had about 10 also. The first one was Schmidt-Hans, or Jan, or Hans, Schmidt-Hans. The second one was Schmidt-Jakob. Now, I'm sure a lot of you are related to Schmidt-Jakobs. And then the third one was Schmidt-Sepp. Now that's the big stone back of us over here. That was one of Grandpa's brothers. And then Daniel was about the 5th one. There are in the family 2 Fraenies. And so I can't quite figure out, for instance, on the first one, John married Franie Gehring. And I called somebody and they said, well, yes, my grandma was Franie. But if you go down here, there's another Franie. So I'm not sure where that goes. Okay. Now Daniel, his tombstone right here, married Katrina. She has a tombstone just like that over just a little ways there. They had a bunch of kids too. When Daniel came over, Daniel and Catherine, they moved on a farm 3.5 miles north of here. That's the farm that Milo and Anna live on, and it's the farm where the Pioneer Schoolhouse used to be. Now actually the schoolhouse was there. That was in 1872. But anyhow, with Daniel, he had 2 brothers and a sister that lived with them. They were both married except the girl. And a couple of years later, they had typhoid fever. And Daniel and 3 of them got it, but Daniel survived. So then that took care of that family. Daniel and Catherine, in approximately 29 years, had accumulated enough land so that all their children could live on farms close by. All but Andrew. He went on to college and got messed up there. So you have Anna, who died, Andreas, and Jacob died in infancy. John D. was 1 year old when they came across. And then they have Peter, that's Peter that some of the Kingman people are here now. Jacob was my dad, and the three others died. And this is what Mrs. Ben L. Stuckey, one of the daughters, said. Our parents lived on a farm. They raised wheat and corn. 1 year, Father took a notion and grew some broom corn and coffee beans. When it was ready, he hired some young folks. We enjoyed it very much. We had our meat, our butter, eggs, potatoes. We grew enough cabbage and made a big barrel of sauerkraut. Mother made some good sweet cheese. Actually, Grandpa was a cheesemaker, also a blacksmith. Now here are some facts or fables. The original house where Daniel and Catherine lived was later moved and used as a chicken house. I think J.M. Gehring moved that. Another item, Grandpa and Grandma sponsored several immigrants coming from America. Among them was a Blondina and I think the Pieskis that are around here. And Richard Schrag said that Grandpa didn't like to unhitch horses, so he let the boys do that for him. He was sort of a little bit on the aristocratic side. I think that's my story about Daniel and Catherine.
Besides, your time's up.
Peter C. Graber and his wife Catherine. And these thoughts that I share with you today are from an ancestry booklet written at the request of her granddaughter, Deborah Jo Jackson, by Teresa B. Graber Crable. As far as I know, I'm not related to the Peter C. Graber family, but for those of you who like to know a little bit about genealogy, I do go back into the Peter P.O. Graber family, and that's as far as I can go back, so we'll have to find somebody else to go farther. As I read, I want you to let your minds envision the trip that brought Peter C. and his family here to Kansas. August 6th, 1874 is a date which, in my own thinking, will remain forever present in the mind of Peter C. Graber. For this is the day when people from neighboring villages gathered at Kostka en route to the railroad station. A 2-day wagon trip from Kostka to Stolbanow brought them to the train station. More than a week's ride on the train throughout Europe included stopping at Brody at the Russian-Austrian border to have luggage checked, and then on to Breslau, a main city in Silesia, and finally arriving at the harbor in Hamburg, Germany. This ended the uncomfortable train ride. For many times there was not enough room to sit, and sometimes it was necessary to change trains, causing them to walk through the city to the next station. They experienced the laughter, the jeers from many of the onlookers as they walked to the next station. There was not much encouragement from the curious at Hamburg while they waited 4 days to set sail for America. Some of the onlookers were envious. Others said only Indians lived there. You'll end up getting killed and scalped. They sailed across the North Sea to Hull, England, and from there they went by rail to Liverpool. It was at Liverpool that they boarded the ship City of Richmond and came to America, landing in the New York harbor on August 31st, 1874. Peter Graber was a farmer, 46 at this time, and his wife Catherine was 42. There were 6 children who landed with them in the New York harbor. They were met by farmers from different states. They contacted the immigrants and took them to their farms, where they were to pay back the loaned money, and they could do so by working on these farms. Peter and his family went to Illinois, while most of the others went to Kansas. Upon arrival in Illinois, one of the children, at age 10, was separated from Father Peter and Mother Catherine, taken to another farm to begin working off his debt. After 2 years working in Illinois, Peter and his family boarded a train for Halstead, Kansas in 1876. From there they traveled by wagon train to Yankton, South Dakota. The hard times, the severe winters in South Dakota, brought them back to Kansas. They settled on a farm 5 miles west and 2 miles south of Moundridge. That would be just a little over a mile west of where we're standing and 2 miles south of where we are today. The 10-year-old child, though, stayed in Illinois to fulfill his 5 years of service to pay off his loan. Then at the age of 14 and a half, he too was able to come to Kansas and rejoin his family. Peter C. Graber was born in Edwardsdorf, Russia, January 1, 1827. At age 21, in the year 1848, he married Catherine Crable, age 17. She was born May 5th, 1831. Peter was in the United States for 4 years before he applied for his naturalization papers on March 14th, 1878. After all 7 of their children left home, Peter and Catherine moved to a smaller house 3/4 of a mile west and 1/8 mile south of Moundridge. Catherine Graber died March 24, 1900, and is buried here in the Hopefield Cemetery where we're standing. After her death, Peter moved to his son's place and lived in a one-room house on the yard which his son built for him. During this time, Peter began chiseling out this tombstone that we are looking at from a large rock to mark his wife Catherine's gravesite. The marker still stands here in her memory, and Martha Graber, whose husband was Eldon Graber, a great-grandson of Peter C., has taken the pains to put a plaque on the tombstone so it's not forgotten. Peter died March 31, 1903, 3 years after Catherine's death. They were granted 52 years of married life together. In my reading, I find that most of Peter's family are located throughout the United States, in such states as Florida, Illinois, Nebraska, Oklahoma, and Kansas. It has been said that Peter and his family were a very lovable couple.
Thank you.
Is Joseph and Magdalene Crable. They had 6 children. The next generation would be number 2. Johann and Susan Crable. They had likewise 6 children. Generation number 3 was Peter and Juanetta Crable. They had 8 children. Generation number 4 was Peter and Catherine Zerger Crable. They had 4 children. And those are Peter, Jacob, Johann, and Anna. And generation number 5 is Johann, and that's my great-great-grandfather here. He was born in 1829. He married Anna Stuckey Crable. They had 6 children, 4 girls and 2 sons. After Anna's death in Russia, Johann moved his family to America. In about year 1874, Johann is buried at the Hopefield Cemetery, row R number 2. Johann passed away in 1889. Johann lived west of Moundridge, and it is believed that he was a farmer, and he was a member of the Hopefield Church. The names of the children were Franny, Katrina, Tobias, Anna, Maria, and Jacob. There's what best I could figure out from Johann and Anna Stuckey. Today there would be about 1,500 descendants from that family. And then generation number 6 would be Jacob and Anna Stuckey. They had 7 children, 2 girls and 5 sons, plus 2 that had passed away as infants. Jacob was born in Hardash, Russia. Jacob and Anna are buried at the Eden Cemetery. He was a farmer west of Elyria. The children that Jacob and Anna Stuckey had were Gus, Jonathan, Felix, Elizabeth, Gideon, Anna, and Menno. Menno is the only surviving member of that family today, of that generation, which was generation number 6. We're moving to generation number 7, which was my grandfather, Jonathan and Mary Stuckey Crable. They had 4 children, Martha, Anna, Elsie, and Ben. They are buried at the Eden Cemetery likewise. Jonathan passed away at a very early age of 36. Generation number 8, which would be my father, was Ben and Jean Vogt Crable. They had 2 children, Richard and Nancy. Generation number 9 was Richard and Deanna Beam Crable. They had 2 children, Priscilla and Teresa. Priscilla would make generation number 10, and she married Jeff Clark, and they have 2 children. The 2 children would be making generation number 11, Madison and Lane, which is my granddaughter and my grandson. The interesting thing that I found was that I found the Crable spelled about 5 different ways, and I understand that when they come to the port of entry, at the port of entry, this gentleman here might have been an Irish, and he was going to spell Crable the way he thought it should be spelled, and the next one down the line may have been some other nationality, and he spelled it his way that he thought it should be spelled. Another thing that I found out, that the Crables had a crest, are also called a family coat of arms. I found out likewise that the Crable name means Crow Hill or Crow on Hill. The Crables can be traced from Germany, Austria, Russia, Zaswell, Switzerland, and then to America. And I've got a picture that a friend got off the internet of the Crable crest, which I found very interesting. I don't know if you can see that. And you see the 2 crows, and one is sitting on a hill. Everybody see that? And that is likewise hanging in Switzerland in a restaurant, from what I understand. It's got some age to it. Thank you.
Thank you. Next move.
A province of Volhynia. I came to this country with my wife Katrina and 6 children on the City of London, arriving in New York City on November 18, 1874. My wife Katrina Gehring was a granddaughter of Moses Gehring. Her grave is next to mine. 2 of my children were married and came earlier. Freeney came with the Kotosufka group on the City of Richmond, and Anna came with the South Dakota group on the City of Chester. We stayed in Warsaw for a time, helping Schweitzers and other Mennonites get passports and immigrate to this country. I came with the Ostrager group. My daughter Maria was the last surviving member of the Schweitzers who came to Kansas. She died at the age of 105. A section of ground directly southwest of here, over there, was reserved for me until I came. I lived in the center of that section. I am considered a good farmer, and I'm careful about my seed selection. To this day, there is little bindweed on section 25. All the land on this section is still owned by my descendants. Today, in the middle of the section are 5 oak trees to mark my homestead. And to this day, the section is known as the Wheatle section, and there is also 20 acres in that section that's never been broken out, and 10 acres in the next section over here that's never been broken out. They're native grass. My father was Johann Wheatle, the first Wheatle in the Schweitzers. Johann left Merriweather, Prussia in 1817 and married Elizabeth Waltner in 1821. She and the baby later died during childbirth. His second marriage was to Anna Schrog in 1823. Both Anna and Johann died prior to 1874. However, Anna married Johann Flickinger, who was 14 years younger after the death of Johann Wheatle. And Johann Flickinger's grave is right here next to us. I had 46 grandchildren who grew to adulthood. One is still living, Esther, Mrs. Ellis Gehring, and she's out here today. Some say that I smoke a pipe. Well, I don't have one right now, and I guess we'll never know. I also have a permit to own a double-barrel shotgun, and some say that I like to hunt. After Katrina died, I married a second time. This marriage was to the mother of my youngest sons. I had a total of 10 children. Peter, my youngest son, and his cousin Peter H. may have been the first Schweitzers to go to Halstead Seminary. Peter J. may have been the first Schweitzer to attend college. He attended Emporia State and graduated from the University of Kansas in 1895. He taught at Bethel College from 1902 to 1957. and wrote the history of Bethel College. His son Waldo became a famous archaeologist and is the only Mennonite to be listed among the 100 famous Kansans. I died in 1914 at the age of 89. And for those of you who don't know, my name is Dwayne Weedle. Jacob B. Weedle was my great-great-grandpa. His son, Andrew Weedle, was my great-grandpa. My grandpa was Andrew's son, Jacob A. Weedle, and my dad is Ronald Weedle.
Thank you. Mr. Kaufman, bust. Go to Flickner's.
1985. I don't know if this committee members or any of them are here, but they consist of Mr. and Mrs. Clarence Graber, Mr. and Mrs. Morris L. Graber, Mr. and Mrs. Homer Gehring, Mr. and Mrs. Merlin Kaufman. The Flickner family record, edited by Hilda E. Graber, Lee Kaufman, copyrighted this report in 1988. From the Flickner family record, it was possible to gather some information regarding the dates and the deaths and the burial locations of several Flickner members that are buried at the Hopefield Cemetery. In the preface of the Flickner family record, Katie B. Graber, nee Flickner, wrote, and I quote, "They were unprepared for the hardships before them, but for such trials they did not weaken their resolution. Step by step they built their theological training. They manifested a wonderful spirit of love and devotion. To the glory of God and the memory of our forefathers, we pause not only to commemorate the kind-hearted faith and heroic sacrifices of our ancestors, but to voice our gratitude to God for the heritage of His promises fulfilled in the valiant deeds. As we honor the past, let us work with an increasing devotion for love, sincerity, and faith." Now, the parents of Andreas Flickner, was Andreas Flickner also, married an Anna Mendelheim. They were married in January the 3rd, 1802. The parents of Anna Crable, the wife of Andreas Flickner, was Michael Crable and Katharina Sutter. The surviving members who lived to rear the families are Peter, Katharina, who is, this is John Voth, Anna, who married Ben Ratzlaff, then John Flickner married Anna Ratzlaff, and then there's Benjamin Flickner married Franny Gehring. Andreas Flickner, born in January 24, 1824, married Anna Flickner in December 25, 1850. Andreas died in September 30, 1889, and this is his marker stone right over here. Anna Flickner, whose gravesite is just a little bit over that side, she died in 1904. Now, Peter A. Flickner, who is my grandfather, he was born in 1853 and married in 1876, and married Maria Gehring Schrag, and she passed away in February the 3rd, 1934. Peter and Maria are buried at Eden Cemetery. The surviving members that reared families have several infants that were buried here in this cemetery, and they're located, their markers are very hard to distinguish because the lettering and everything is pretty well worn through and we can't find it, but I did locate them, and I have some sheets here that those who are interested in finding the locations of that, you're welcome to have some of these sheets. And I think this concludes my report.
Okay, goes to my left, STU, and to my right, Q, so on back to the beginning of the cemetery. That concludes this part of the tour. We'll have another one at 4:15 and 5 different families. So we'll see you then.
And if you need programs. And let's see, may I have one of those two? And let's see. Well, let's see. I will get. Katrina married Christian Smith.
Okay, we'll do it again at 4:50. We'll be here. Thank you.
Anna married the Flickton.
Along these voices blending into each other with the naming and moving on.
Shots
and,
of the tombstones and
You see the candles already?
Well, okay, how does this river fit in there? That is one of the probably not. They didn't bury them together. They didn't use to. I think that's great.
They just decided they wanted some of this on a professional video camera. Maybe in the future to do a real video sequence, but here we're just taping the tape.
Really?
Yeah.
We have emptied the bench here in front, so some of you that are standing, there's some room here. We will go ahead and begin. I'm Elmer Schrag, and as chair of the Swiss Mennonite Cultural and Historical Association, I was asked to officially welcome you to this celebration of the 125th anniversary of the coming of the Swiss Wilhelmians to this very site. But I don't know how I welcome someone to their own homestead, because in a sense, that's what this is. This is your area, this is your history, this is your heritage. But to make it official, welcome. I wish for you a spiritual renewal as you revisit the storehouse of your memories. And I trust that the door to that storehouse will be nudged open by the presenters you will hear, by the activities outdoors, by the displays at the Eden Church, by the Essen and the Versammlung tonight at the Eden Church. So welcome, reflect, and enjoy. And above all, as someone on the committee has said, vergessen nicht. Forget not. I would like for you to grant me a special personal privilege. Shortly after the 1998 annual meeting of the Swiss Mennonite Cultural and Historical Association, the executive committee of that board met with this celebration in mind. And typically, we asked somebody else to do it. We had our vice president, Arnold Wadel, and our treasurer, Delbert Gehring, gather a committee to plan this celebration. And they have done that, and they have worked hard. This is a special committee comprised of special people. Their names are printed in the program, and I would invite you to tell them so, how much you appreciate this coming about. I commend them for their hard work and their insight. I also want to thank the Hopefield Church, this church, and the Eden Church for the hospitality in hosting this celebration. And now, Ralph Lehman has an announcement, and after that we will follow the printed program.
Thank you, Elmer. I'd take only a few minutes on behalf of a small group of persons who call themselves the Swiss Publications Committee to tell you something about the publication and the republication of some significant books to our Swiss Wilhelmian heritage. The most significant of these books is a republication of a classic which has been out of print perhaps for 8 to 10 years, The European History of the Swiss Mennonites from Volhynia, and it's the Martin Schrag book. Because this has been out of print, the committee felt it was very important to republish and to make it available, especially for this celebration. Now, this contains the original Schrag script, but in addition, some very interesting and significant new material. There is a 50-page addendum with lots of pictures, with new maps and new information, and some very few original text corrections. For example, a map on the back of this book is a map of the Ukraine and identifies the locations where the Swiss Volhynian congregations lived in the Ukraine. So it's a very useful, now 1999 enriched version of the original Martin Schrag book. The second book is an entirely new publication, and it is called The Swiss Mennonite Memorial Monument. It asks the question, is it inspirational art, symbolic expression, or history? A reading of this book would soon give the answer that it is indeed all of these things and more. Last summer, when our entire family, our 4 children, their spouses, and our 7 grandchildren were with us in Newton, we made a pilgrimage to the Swiss Mennonite Memorial Monument. It was a wonderful, inspirational experience for our family. The older grandchildren read the inscriptions on the 7 plaques. We talked about them, and this was in this beautiful setting where we are today. The wheat field out here, almost ripe, the setting of the immigrant house, and of course this Hopefield church. Our children were learning something important about their Swiss Volhynian heritage, and it was a really wonderful experience for all of us. Now, there's just very quickly an earlier book published in 1974, A Century of Russian Mennonite History in America. There are still some copies available, and this book is available at the book table out under the tent. Lastly, this is another book that's been out of print for some time. The Centennial Treasury of Recipes. Just this morning, a woman said, I have been wanting to get this book for years. It's been not available, and it is now available because it's been reissued. She bought 8 copies at $15 each for her daughters, her daughter-in-laws, and her granddaughters. And we did the same thing for our children. So it is now available. Now, as you know, lastly, the publication costs of books today are much greater than they were 25 years ago when the 1974 books were published. These books today are being offered at essentially the publication costs. And there are some very special prices today. For example, the Martin Schrag book with its addendum is $12.50, but today it's $10 and it's less for multiple copies. So the books are available at the book table. Thank you, Elmer, for giving me the opportunity to speak briefly about these books.
Shall we pray? Great and eternal God, God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, yes, God of our forebears and God of all of history, we pause in praise and adoration before a God that inspired our ancestors 125 years ago to be willing to suffer, yes, and even die if need be, in search of the opportunity to live and to worship in a land of peace and tranquility. Dear God, it was faith in you that moved people to cross oceans and face hardships and danger in search of this land where they could live in peace and work and witness for their faith and for their God. We're gathered here to commemorate obedience to our God and to those who have gone before and have lived courageously and preserved for us a great heritage. We pray, bless us as heirs of that faith, and may we ever be a light to a darkened world and a salt to a needy earth. And so we ask, Lord, that you bless this day, and may it enable all of us to carry the torch of Jesus Christ to those who may follow. We ask it in the name of Jesus Christ, our Lord and Savior. Amen.
Und das Blut des 125 years of the 475-year history of the Swiss Volinian Anabaptist Mennonites have transpired in the United States of America. This ethnic group, our ancestors, chose to emigrate from Russia to the United States in 1874 when various aspects of their ethnic identity were threatened. They came to America where they were promised wide-ranging freedoms and a marked tolerance for diversity amongst a whole array of other minority groups. They settled on the Kansas and South Dakota prairies to reestablish themselves in the New World. They were agricultural and rural people, not industrial and urban. That's why they settled on the plains of Kansas and South Dakota and not in the cities of New York, Philadelphia, or Chicago, as did other immigrants. So they were really people of the prairie people. But this immigrant group was also plunged into a larger prevailing cultural milieu which resolved to make out of this and other groups a melting pot. The Latin phrase, e pluribus unum, one out of many, was taught in the elementary schools we all attended as a worthy goal for all Americans. It is a national motto stamped on the coins of the United States of America. Perhaps this unity with diversity was not too difficult to accept by our immigrants, because Jesus had also invited his followers to all become one. But this was the pressure between separatism and amalgamation. In these past 125 years in America, what has happened to these prairie people? What has happened to these prairie people, to the ethnic identity of this group of Swiss Mennonite immigrants and their descendants under the press of forces and circumstances pushing them to become one? What has happened to these prairie people in terms of their religious affiliation and beliefs, their occupations, their geographic locations, their education? When looked at in this way, it is obvious that these prairie people have literally become a world people. What have been the important experiences that have shaped us? What are the stories we have been told? What are the uniquenesses of this group that are worth preserving? What stands out in your mind? Which stories from your family or community are worth recalling in this process? The recalling and retelling of our stories is something that can be undertaken by each and every one of us, with resulting value for each individually and collectively, even if the future remains very uncertain. This afternoon, we want to spend to give just a few snapshots or windows on this picture by a diverse group of 10 selected descendants. Because we wanted to include as large a number of participants as possible in a very limited time period, it was necessary to ask each presenter to adhere strictly to his or her allotted time. Each person was told he or she would have 5 minutes to tell a story, to make a statement about something that has become meaningful and so is a part of the larger story of this people. When the 5 minutes are up, I'm supposed to give them a signal, and they're supposed to end the sentence or the thought and be seated. I even brought a stopwatch, but I don't think I'll use it. The next listed speaker after the one is done will try to addressing us is Delbert Gehring. He is a teacher. I'm going to be able to only give a very slight introduction. They all deserve an hour to tell you what they've got to say. They've got 5 minutes, and they are splendid people. Delbert's a teacher, retired school administrator, farmer. He's many other things. He's got something to say.
I think Jake's 5 minutes were almost up. At noon today, my wife noticed that I had some apprehension about this assignment. And she said, "Don't try to be witty or appear intelligent, just be yourself." So, with that encouragement, we'll take a look at military exemption,
Loss of military exemption was one of the reasons our ancestors left Russia. In 1873, a team of 12 spies, including one Swiss German, Andreas Schrag, investigated the prairie states, and they requested military exemption for Russian immigrants. Canada officials gave their approval, but the same was denied by the United States. However, Kansas, Nebraska, and Minnesota were all competing to get these good farmers into their country, and they allowed exemption at the state level, but it wasn't automatic. There were things to prove, like Mennonite church membership was one. As early as 1875, the first year here, representatives of the congregation had to appear in the county court to get an exemption, and this had to be renewed annually. Now let's skip forward about 40 years to World War I. The Mennonites in all parts of the country were facing considerable opposition because of their use of the German language. And there was no provision in the draft law for COs other than non-combatant in the military. Mennonite boys were drafted, and wearing the uniform became a very serious issue that they struggled with. They were subjected to ridicule and tongue lashing, and at least one Schweitzer refused even the non-combatant role and was sentenced to Fort Leavenworth prison for 7 months. That was Ed J.B. Waltner of South Dakota. It became increasingly clear that a better alternative to military was needed. 2 decades later, in 1940, we were again faced with conscription. The Mennonite leadership, with many trips to Washington, cooperated with the government officials and carved out an alternate program which became civilian public service. It was satisfactory to the churches, even if they had to finance it. What was the Swiss Bohemian involvement? In most of our Kansas Swiss churches, a majority of draftees went the CPS route. One church as high as 85%. Again, at least one person was incarcerated for non-registration, that being Carl J. Stuckey of Hopefield. An interesting note concerning Carl: had he registered, he would have never been called up, as he wouldn't have passed his physical. He was in a long period of recovery, hospitalization, because of burns in a farm accident. But he didn't avoid it. He chose to make a statement by not registering. In camp administration, we find lots of Schweitzer names in leadership roles. The CPS directory lists camp directors named Graber, Miller, several Schrags, 4 Gehrings, a Flickinger, a Kaufman, and others. So we were very much involved. But is there a danger that we can get lulled to sleep in times of peace? Have we at times been reluctant to tell our story? Do we fear abuse and ridicule as earlier COs had received? The story out of CPS camp at Fort Collins, we had a softball team there that played in the City League. They were known as Poudre Valley CPS, and they had big letter CPS across the front of their jerseys. One spectator asked a camper what those letters stand for, and the camper wasn't sure what the inquirer was after, so he quickly said, "Catchers, pitchers, and shortstops." Now, he wasn't quite telling the whole story. Well, here is an example of one who didn't pass up a chance to tell it. A draftee traveling home by train was asked by his seatmate why a man of his age was in civilian clothes. He answered that he was serving in the alternate program for conscientious objectors. The pacifist position was entirely new to this man, and an interesting discussion followed. They talked about biblical reasons for non-resistance, as well as the heritage of the early Anabaptists. Finally, the man asked, "If your people have had this for 400 years, why don't the rest of us know about it?" If we have something good to share, let's not hide it.
Done by the mothers and grandmothers of our rich heritage. My link to this heritage came through a great-grandmother, Anna Schrag Stuckey, wife of Reverend John J. Stuckey. She was born on the plains of Russia and trekked to America with the group at the age of 16. She was small of stature, but strong of will and physically able to work like a man. Her grandchildren said of her, "Grandma can pitch hay and milk cows as well as any man." To her, housework was a drag, especially cooking. Oatmeal 2 or 3 times a day suited her just fine. So during the busy season, great-grandpa John would on occasion find a reason to go to town just before noon so he could stop at his daughter Katie's for a nice hot meal. As a kid growing up, there were not many occasions where I saw her, but I knew 2 things. One was, you had to talk German to great-grandma Anna. She informed us that God only hears and speaks German. Other prayers will never reach him. And secondly, you always shook hands with Grandma Anna. And if you ever shook hands with her once, you made sure you didn't have rings on the second time. She acquired this strength from cow milking, which she continued to do well into her 80s. In fact, I think they sold the cows so Grandma couldn't milk anymore. Her hands were so big and strong that she would tell the story of how as a girl on the plains of Russia, she would milk all 4 faucets on the cow at the same time. My husband says, don't tell that story, it can't be true, but maybe they had different cows in Russia. But the Bolsheviks, the Russian people, she said, would come and they'd throw coins at her, and she'd pick them up and put them in her apron pocket, and those she got to keep, which was rare at that time. She told of the strength of these people and said they were mächtige Leid und unsere Leid hatten viel Angst von diesen Leid. When I was senior in high school, great-grandma came to live with us for about 6 weeks or so. It was a highlight for me because I could understand the German and talked it enough to ask the questions. I heard many stories. She was about 94 at this time, did not have a tooth in her mouth. Store-bought teeth didn't work to eat with, she said, and she never was too much into vanity. Those of you who remember her probably remember the schwarze Tracht mit Kopftuch, wie das, und black high-top shoes, and the wart over one eye, which she always tried to cover. On an everyday basis, during the winter, she put a band of garlic cloves and onions around her neck to avoid catching cold. At night, she rubbed with Raleigh's pain oil, which had a smell of its own. All food and drink had to be body temperature before eaten. Coffee was cooled, ice cream melted. Because of her age, the doctor prescribed a tonic, a tablespoon of geritol or wine, he said, which Mom gave her every morning. Before long, she would sing the hymns at the top of her lungs. We loved it. She told us about how beautiful the country of Russia was, how houses stood in rows and people worked and helped each other. She talked of the harsh winters and the snow, how she didn't want to leave her beautiful homeland. One day I particularly remember was the day that Uncle Jakob Krabel came to visit Asta, his daughter brought him. Now several weeks before that, Uncle Jakob had fallen down the steps and hat sich ganz verschlagen, schwarz und blau, and was in a lot of pain. He explained this all to Grandma, and Grandma said, "Ach, Jakob, das ist nicht so schlimm. Wenn du so alt bist wie ich, dann kannst du doch jammern." He was 88 at the time. It has been told to me by her grandchildren that on a few occasions, great-grandmother, at a time when women could not vote in the church or anywhere else and were not to speak out in church, stood right over there during sharing time and gave a talk, sometimes rather harshly, about things going on in the church that were not godlike and needed to change. Our forefathers were women of courage and strength who worked hard to see that their families' needs were met. This came first. God help us as women today, and men as well, to put our families' needs first, in spite of modern conveniences, jobs outside the home, and technology. Great-grandma came and she left. After a while, the garlic smell left too, but the precious memories of the days and the stories live on in my heart.
We shall proceed right along.
I'll speak any German in mine. Good afternoon. As we dawn a new century, many events have transfigured this millennium. In the review of each, its individual accomplishment has to be recalled in the context of time frame in which that particular event took place. For example, it is not a feat in present day to imagine a mobile passenger conveyor or a winged motorized bird, as we have many examples of an automobile and airplane currently in existence. Given the event I'm going to talk about took place over 90 years ago, let's see how a small Midwest engineer took on the challenge. The time was just after the last turn of the century, a time that saw Theodore Roosevelt as the man in the White House, a time that was 10 years before Babe Ruth played his first Major League Baseball game, a time 20 years before Al Jolson first broke the silence and spoke in a film. That is the time that John J. Schrag took on the awesome task of draining the Big Basin. The Big Basin was located in McPherson County, in between the towns of McPherson and Conway. At its flooded height, the basin covered upwards of 2,000 acres. Also, it provided a wildlife resort, as being before the days of daily bag limits, there are numerous reports of hunters killing 80 to 90 ducks in a few hours. Perhaps, though, the best reason of why the McPherson County engineers asked for John Schrag to drain the basin is this article from the McPherson Republican dated June 18, 1901. Are toads coming? The toads are in the basin and there are millions of them. An old settler was out to that body of water the other day and reports it is full of toads. He believed when they began to move on, they will cover the county as they did 12 years ago. Then they came in droves and made walking in town impossible after dark. In the roads near the city, they filled the ruts and were crushed by the hundreds. The epidemic lasted about a week, it taking that length of time for the toads to pass through the city. Now, the man to take on this formidable task was a well-known person in the area. John had engineered a resourceful dam for the Alta Mill, invented several agricultural products that he patented, and even was selected the main carpenter for this church, Hopefield, Mennonite, which was built in 1882. John began his quest by purchasing land in the basin area between 1901 and 1911. After having acquired enough land to begin, John set out with his plan. This plan was to incorporate a series of dikes and ditches to remove and carry excess water around his acreage and into the Blaze Fork Creek. In order to make these dikes, he at first used a diker and then eventually a slip and a Fresno. The diker was a machine that had a conveyor belt on it to move ground, much like a present-day auger moves grain, while the slip and Fresno were blades to push dirt pulled by a team of horses. This allowed for him to build most of the dikes and ditches he wanted, except it didn't allow him to cut through a 15-foot high hill in the basin's south rim. This hill was too steep for horses and for his diker. For this task, John Schrog decided he needed a steam shovel. Now recall, the time frame is the early teens of this century. Henry Ford is just beginning to roll Model Ts off his assembly lines, and John Schrog wants to build a steam shovel in central Kansas. First, he cut huge cottonwood trees near his home. Then he cut off 4 18-inch foot sections from the trees for the wheels. Next, he constructed a wood platform on top of the wheels for the steam boiler, which had been delivered by rail car from Kansas City. Then he used a telephone-sized pole to make the crane end, and at the top of this pole had a pulley to control the bucket for moving ground. By pulling on ropes over a drum drive, one could direct the pole and the bucket. In order to move this machine was another task, since it didn't have a powertrain to drive the wheels. A fence hedge post would be inserted into the ground approximately 100 feet away from the steam shovel. The shovel would then be blocked and tackled or pulled along with a line in order to move it. When it was done at that workstation, another fence hedge post went in 100 feet away, and the process was repeated. By using this homemade steam shovel, John cut through that 15-foot high hill and was able to complete building the ditches and dikes. This effectively blocked approximately 20,000 acres of surface water from draining into the big basin and diverted the water into the Blaze Fork Creek. As we get ready to turn the page on yet another century, we should recall the start of the last, when a young man with his horse-drawn slips and homemade steam shovel drained the big basin and changed both ecologically and economically this part of the world, Mr. John J. Schrog, my great-grandfather.
In spite of a flub, Suderman, she was born in South Dakota and is a teacher and lived for many years in many other places, but recently moved to Kansas. Alice?
I feel a little bit like Edgar Bergen with Charlie McCarthy, but my little girl here is not here to speak, but she is here to serve as an example of the artistry of Charles J. Kaufman. Charles Kaufman was a Schweitzer from South Dakota who shared his talents both with South Dakota and Kansas Mennonites. As a volunteer today at the Kaufman Museum, I was given permission to bring her here to join us for our festivities. She spends her days in the log cabin at the museum, and were she able to think and speak, I think she would know by memory the little talk that Uncle Carl used to give when we'd go through the museum, and I know many of you have heard it as I have. The last words of his little talk are these: "This log cabin is a remembrance to the early settlers. In this home, people experienced all the hardships of the early days. Here we feel that we're standing on sacred ground, ground that has been hallowed by our ancestors." He carved a pioneer family of 4 out of wood, and he dressed them in authentic clothing of the period, even finding little high-button shoes like the other lady was talking about. I thought that must have been quite a find when he found those tiny little shoes. Charles Kaufman was my great uncle, brother to my grandmother, Anna Kaufman, who was the first wife of John C. Kaufman, who served as pastor of this church, Hopefield, from 1937 to 1939. There are those among us who share talents that are exceptional and generous, and I feel that we sometimes, refer to them as 10 talent people. I think that Charles Kaufman was such a person. His legacy includes not only the thousands of artifacts that he contributed when he brought his museum from South Dakota to Kansas and shared it here with so many people, but he also wanted to preserve the cultural history of our people, as evidenced in the log cabin exhibit. He was not afraid of hard work to accomplish a goal, and had endless patience as he carved or painted with intricate detail. Another characteristic of Uncle Carl was his love of nature. This quote of his expresses how taxidermy provided an avenue to communicate that love to others. And I quote, "Who has not been enchanted by the magnificence of nature, and who has not felt a desire to have such moments of enchantment prolonged?" He did indeed prolong those moments of enchantment for us through the skill of taxidermy, which he used to preserve beautiful pheasants, ducks, songbirds, small and large animals. And he learned this skill over a period of 10 years through a correspondence course, starting at the age of 15. Charles J. Kaufman was born in 1882 near Marion, South Dakota, near Freeman too, and died in 1961 in Newton, Kansas. His parents, Jacob P. Kaufman and Catherine Schrag Kaufman, were born in Waldheim, Volhynia, Russia. His father was a rather colorful man in his own right. The story goes that when he came to America in 1876 on an adventure trip, he didn't have a lot of baggage with him, but under his arm he had a violin. In his pocket he had $2.50. And promptly he spent his $2.50 on a new hat. His nickname was Bonestecke, which means beanstalk, because he was tall and slender. Charles met his good wife, Fanny Schrag, when she was his student in the state of Washington, where he was teaching school. While courting her later by mail from South Dakota, apparently the relationship, the letters weren't quite, they were a little one-sided. So he wrote to her and said, with apologies to Robert Burns, "If a body writes a body and the body don't reply, should a body write a body and ask the reason why?" And that did it. She started writing more faithfully. They eventually were married in 1908 and had 3 children, Ralph, Lloyd, and Rose. It was Uncle Carl's desire to pass on to others the inspiration he found in God's beautiful world. A prayer he shared at the 1941 opening of the Kaufman Museum at Bethel College expresses that desire. And I quote, "Lord, give me light that I may show for thee beauties others pass without a thought, that men with mortal eyes may see the world is full of wonders thou hast wrought." And I believe God answered that prayer of this humble man.
I think you'll agree we're getting some great stories here.
My talk is those who didn't come to America in 1874. There's a sheet passed out. There aren't nearly enough copies, but maybe you'll be able to look 3 or 4 or 5 of a copy or something. The first family I'd like to talk about is Andreas Gehring and Frenny Stuckey. Frenny Stuckey was a sister of Reverend Jakob Stuckey, the elder in this congregation that brought this congregation here. She was apparently very ill in 1874. She died on the 6th of September of that year, 1 week after the ship docked in New York. She was not aboard that ship. She stayed in Russia, and her husband and all of her children did also. I have been unable to find out on any ship list when they exactly came to this country. I have it written someplace that her husband, the widower Andreas, came in 1877, but the family apparently was completely disintegrated. Came at various times. One daughter, Carolina Gehring, the 4th child, was here and was married in this church in 1876. She married John Weedle here. The oldest member of the family was Jakob Gehring. He married Katharina Schrag. He never came to this country. He stayed in Russia. We know of 4 children of theirs. Most of them married. One of them married a Wanda Lavika. One of them married an Emma Michki. They generally married people who were of the professional class in Russia, and that family stayed. As late as in the 1930s, in an obituary, I ran across an item that one of these children had relatives still living in Russia. The second family is the second on this list, if you have the list handy, and that's the family of Benjamin Schrag and Maria Graber. Benjamin Schrag was a brother of Katerina Schrag, who stayed in Russia. Benjamin remained there. We know of 5 children of his. On page 82 in the Martin Schrag book, this is the new edition, it is stated that Benjamin Schrag and 2 of his sons, Johann and Julius, went to Austria, and where they were no longer members of the Mennonite church. Otherwise, almost nothing is known of this Schrag family. We know that they did have 3 children, 3 daughters, as well as the 2 sons. The next family is the Jakob K. Schrag family. Jakob was a brother of Benjamin, so there were a sister and 2 brothers, all Schrags, who stayed in Russia. Jakob K. Schrag married a Freni Graber. They apparently became quite wealthy in Russia. They decided to immigrate after all and came to this country in 1891. They came to South Dakota, became members of the North Church. I'll take up one member of this family, and instead of recounting stories about all of them, Katerina, who was the 9th child, was well educated. The father and mother brought tutors into the home in Russia. Katerina was sent to Lemberg, Austria, where she was baptized and received catechism instruction in the Lemberger Gemeinde, or the Lemberger Church. She attended a university in Russia. She must have started when she was quite young, because she was 18 when they came to this country. She married Jonathan Woldner, and they lived on a farm in South Dakota. In 1923, they opened a confectionery store in Fremont, and she spent the rest of her life with her husband running that store. The last family I'd like to talk about is Peter Pett Graber, who married Anna Gehring. They remained in Russia. I'd like to talk about their 8th child, who was also named Peter. He came to this country in 1902. He also went to South Dakota, joined the North Church, where he met and married Helena Ortman. They lived with her parents for the first year of their marriage, which was quite customary in the old world. His wife became pregnant, and one day his mother-in-law gave him some money, $80, to go to town and buy some groceries and to buy some things for the coming nursery for the baby. He went into town and he saw a beautiful bracelet in a store, and he thought that'd be great for my wife, and he bought it. He went home and his in-laws were furious. They kicked him out of the house, that furious. He showed up after the birth of his child, within a day or 2 after the birth of his child, with Reverend Kaufman from the North Church, and asked if he could see his wife and baby, and the wife was still in bed at the time, called out no, and the in-law said no. The mother, who was, as I said, was bedfast, died about a week after the birth. The child was raised by her grandparents. It was a girl. Peter Graber went to Canada and lived in Winnipeg, and he's buried in the Winnipeg Cemetery. Thank you.
Next is
the highlight of the 125th celebration is a musical piece. Vocal music is in our genes. In Martin Schrag's European History, page 130, I describe the last worship service of the Katazuvka congregation, in which Elder Jacob Stuckey asked some of the men to stand up and sing in 4-part harmony. J.H. Stuckey, commonly known as Hagenvetter, grandfather to Dean and Dale, and youngest son of Elder Jacob Stuckey, who incidentally sang quite well himself, used to say that the vocal voices in the Freeman, Moundridge, and Pretty Prairie Swiss communities blended and had a unique quality that no other community could match, and he was pretty widely traveled. Another thing. On October the 19th, 1874, Jakob Stuckey, spelled Jakob, S-T-U-C-K, no C, S-T-U-K-I, purchased the northwest of 1921-2, that field right there, from the Atchison, Topeka and Santa Fe Railroad for $373. According to the U.S. survey noted in the deed, it consisted of 149 acres, which meant that he paid $2.50 an acre. He made his home on this quarter and lived about a fourth of a mile north. The driveway was to the Kaufmans, who run the dairy in the next mile. On January the 14th, 1875, the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railroad gave Elder Jacob Stuckey 149 acres, the southwest quarter. It's the quarter that you're now sitting in of this particular section for $1. It was in his name for 5 years until January the 22nd, 1880, when Jacob Stuckey and Barbara Stuckey, his wife, and now they're spelled the same way as we would spell them, his wife gave it to the Hopefield Society of the Mennonite Church, a corporation. Joshua P. and Tobias Stuckey, Elder Jacob's sons, purchased the northeast quarter of the section for $2.50 an acre. This half section immediately to the north of the church here has been in Stuckey hands for 125 years. In these 125 years, I think the question might be asked about the wisdom of this purchase. Would Elder Jacob Stuckey have been wiser and richer if he had invested in the stock market? In writing and publishing material on the Swiss Mennonites, I sometimes wonder if it's not like adding about 2 drops to the waters of the Pacific Ocean, because so much has already been written about Mennonites and every other conceivable topic. And sometimes I wonder, why in the world am I doing it? Why am I adding some more? And yet I do it because I have received so much from this community and from my heritage that I think it's very important. For me, it's just as important as doing mission work, as making a contribution to the MCC for relief, and so on. Perhaps it's part of my teaching ministry. There are, of course, those who constantly tell me, Harley, you're only doing it to make money. And for those who think that publishing materials for the Swiss Mennonites is a way of making money, maybe they ought to try to sell wheat for $2. In the Wichita Eagle of July the 8th, 1999, Becky Tanner talked about 40,000 Mennonites celebrating their 125th anniversary this year. I wonder what percentage will actually celebrate. 25%? 50%? 75%? I wonder what percentage of collective descendants will celebrate the 200th anniversary of our ancestors' coming. I wonder what percent of the Swiss Mennonites who moved out of the community, perhaps to the city in the first generation, or the second generation, or the third generation, and so on, will celebrate. My grandfather, Crable, had a brother who moved to Texas. I did hear from one of the cousins who wanted one of the books that I had published some years ago. But that's the only one of the cousins. He had a sister who also married out, and as far as I know, have never made a contact back into the Mennonite community. I know that some gain experience and others carry very away fond memories from these celebrations. Unfortunately, our memories fade and we can't have celebrations every year, so what do we salvage from these celebrations? What do we have? And what do we have to retain? And what do we have to share? Ethnic foods? Some of us will marry spouses who have no concept of Swiss ethnic foods. I know of people who were present at various functions, but who have no idea of the kind of foods and ethnic dishes that we have. I also know of people who attended the 75th anniversary celebrations and the 100th anniversary celebrations. And I know that in general they have some fond memories of those occasions. But as individuals who leave the community, as individuals, it is almost impossible to retain much of our Swiss faith and heritage. I think we want to retain more of it than the term prairie people, because to me that includes all those who lived in the prairies from Texas to Canada. In the early days, when there were 53 families that settled in this area and they had a community, they put things in what I call the community basket of Swiss Mennonite faith and heritage. There were 53 families. I expect a little more from South Dakota because there were 99 there. And this was kind of a potluck carry-in kind of meal. One topic seems to suggest that we want some of the goodies of this community basket to flow down and trickle down in the generations to come. Now there's an old rule of thumb that says something like this: you get out of something about what you put into it. If you don't put anything into it, you won't get anything out of it. If you read some books, if you engage others in conversation, if you work on your genealogy, if you prepare ethnic foods, even when the spouses are non-Mennonites, but you talk about it, you have a chance of some of this community basket of faith and heritage trickling down. And that can happen if you live 1,000 miles away or halfway across the earth. But it doesn't necessarily happen unless people work at it deliberately. There are people in Moundridge who recognize this community value of faith and heritage in this area, but who haven't even driven out of Moundridge to look at the monument or to see this church. They haven't put anything into the basket, and they're not getting anything out of the basket. On the other hand, those people living way away may get something out of the basket. What we really are looking for in these kind of celebrations is we want to get everyone to have a little bit of salt and light. Salt that would permeate the rest of society. Swiss Mennonite goodies of faith and culture and history to permeate the society. There are some people who do is, Dear Mr. Stuckey, on a family trip to the Swiss Volinian Monument at the Hopefield Church, what a wonderful experience we had as our children and their cousins took time reading the inscriptions that were so beautifully explained, the ethnic and ethical heritage. This was also a fabulous opportunity for our non-Mennonite spouses to gain a quick understanding of the philosophy and history of their marriage partners. I am personally grateful that this monument will be available to my grandchildren and their grandchildren, as that they may feel as proud of their heritage as I do. Mind you, that's kind of interesting. I never expected a letter like that. So she says, she ends up this, you have done an excellent job representing our Swiss Volinian traditions with the design of the monument itself, as well as with the inscribed text. On behalf of my siblings, our children, and the generations to come, please accept our thanks. So if you travel far from here, you may come back to this community again, home. There will be a monument with all of its symbolism available for you, and maybe for your great-great-grandchildren to ponder, and even if only non-Mennonite neighbors ponder the trickle of Swiss Mennonite faith, culture, and heritage. Perhaps even then, something of this history will survive.
You've already heard from a couple. I'm just taking this away. Oh, okay. Leanne is the one. Leanne is a teacher and a conference worker and has been heard from and will be heard from.
Whatever that means. Okay, orchestra, let's start at the beginning of movement 1. Ready? Okay. Violas, you're too loud. There's so many of you. You know, I know it's Martinezzo Forte, but if you play pianissimo, it'll probably be okay because there are a lot of you. You know, that reminds me, when I was a teacher in Smolin, Kansas, I had one viola, and that poor kid had to play loud all the time. But that's not the case for you. You can just play pianissimo will be fine. Okay, let's go back to the beginning. All right, here we go. 1, 2, ready, play. Violins, you're flatting. You're very flat. You know, that reminds me too. When I was a girl growing up in Moundridge, Kansas, my uncle, whose name was Mr. Flickner, Mr. E.E. Flickner, told me I always sang flat, but he said it could be remedied. So I think violins, your problem can be remedied. Think high, listen to each other, play on top of the note, don't play underneath the note, okay? All right, let's try this again. All right, let's go back to measure 12, okay? All right, here we go. Ah, good job. Yes, did you hear how it sounds when it's right? The rhythm must be precise, absolutely precise. And you need to play the pitch in the middle of the note.
And that's what makes a good sound. You know, music is great. It develops the personality. It's wonderful. Pardon me, are you looking for someone? I am Adina Gehring. Yeah, I'll do an interview. We have just a couple more minutes here of orchestra, and then I'll meet you in my office. All right. Orchestra, good job, good job. Practice makes perfect, you know. We'll see you tomorrow. Oh, I bet you're the reporter from the Western Michigan College newspaper, aren't you? And I know what you want. You want to interview me about that scandal, about the concert last night? Well, I want to tell you my story. I really would like to take this opportunity to explain what happened. You see, last night at the concert, they asked me to conduct the Star-Spangled Banner. Well, I cannot do that. I'm a pacifist, I'm sorry, but I cannot do that, so I refused. Now, I'll probably get fired, but that's just beside the point. I don't believe that you can play patriotic songs and religious songs in the same concert. I frankly don't believe in the words of the Star-Spangled Banner, and so it would be a hypocrisy for me to play it or conduct it. I have belonged to the Fellowship of Reconciliation for a number of years, and I try to live out my beliefs. Now, I'll tell you a little bit about my background, and then maybe you'll know where I'm coming from. I was born in 1903 in Moundridge, Kansas. I was the second in a family of 9 children. Now, you may not know that Mennonites are pacifists, but Moundridge was a Mennonite community. Our family was close. Many times we children would organize sings. One New Year's Eve, we even organized a surprise celebration of singing for our parents. Music was important. I even went other places to give music lessons. And sometimes my little brother Orlo Gehring would go along and he'd entertain kids while I was giving lessons. So music was important. After that, I went to Bethel College, which is our Mennonite college, and then I began to teach in little small schools. Attica, Burden, Sharon, Partridge several times, and then I even taught in Moundridge. Moundridge was my home community. And when I taught there, we had a great time. We did operettas in the summer, and you know, the first year I taught there, those people didn't even know the names of the instruments. And by the end of the year, we got second at state contest. And then I was asked to be on a state committee to help pick music for a state music festival. And one year, we even got the first prize at the state contest when it was held at Kansas Wesleyan University. I don't think that has anything to do with this scandal. Well, anyway, if the president of Western Michigan College wants to fire me, that's fine. He can do that because I simply won't compromise my beliefs. Thanks for letting me tell you my story. And now I have to go on and give a cello lesson. Adina Gehring, or Din, as she was called by her immediate family, or she was called Tootsie by those outside of her family, was not fired from her position at Western Michigan College. After teaching there for 4 years, Adina became ill and 10 days later died at the age of 39. I'm going to end with a quote. This is a quote from Adina. If in my teaching I have molded and shaped character, the silver cup, many of which she earned, becomes a symbol not only of fine art, but of noble effort, of patience, perseverance, of sympathy, and of love.
Dean Gehring was music teacher at Moundridge High School when I was a student there, and that touched me. Would you want to bring that podium, please? Here is James Yonke, college professor, whatever else he is, the son of William Yonke, whom I knew well. Jim, tell us what you have to say.
In the 1860s and 1870s, Alexander II, the Tsar of Russia, initiated a series of reforms which led our ancestors to leave their homes in Volhynia and Polish Russia to come to the plains. His reforms were not directed against Mennonites. The biggest reform was the emancipation of the serfs. Serfdom in Russia was akin to slavery. In America, it's instructive that Alexander eliminated serfdom without a war. We had the Civil War to eliminate slavery. For people of German or German-Swiss background, Alexander's most important reform was to insist upon the Russianization of foreign language people living in Russia. They should be subject to local Russian authorities. They should teach in the Russian language in their schools. They should be subject to the Russian military draft, or at least to alternative civilian service. Again, there's a parallel to the situation in America. In America, the Mennonites and other immigrants were subject to Americanization. Our ancestors faced a decision. Shall we trade Russianization for Americanization? Is it more godly to pray in English or in Russian? There were some people who said, don't go. It wasn't an easy decision. There was a Professor Rauschenbusch, a German who had emigrated to America, who wrote he was a Baptist, he wrote in the Baptist newspapers and admonished people living in Russia not to come to America, that is the Germans. And Mennonites read these articles, and here's one Mennonite who stayed in Russia, writing to Mennonites who had come only 2 years after that, quoting Rauschenbusch, who said, I have received your letter and note that many of your church members are inclined to emigrate to America. I have pondered this with brethren of insight before the Lord. Remain where you are in Russia. If you wish to remain Germans, then you must go to Germany. Here in America, an individual may be a German, but at least grandchildren or great-grandchildren will adopt English customs and language. I sometimes think with horror how the American people have degenerated more and more. For 12 years ago, God punished us with the Civil War. But there is little fruit and repentance, and in a decade we might have the second Civil War and third Civil War. Then who will not of himself take up weapons, or will be compelled to? Are not the Christians the salt of the earth? Rather be a salt in Russia. There would be people today who would argue that moral decay in America bears out Rauschenbusch's prediction, even though his prediction of coming Civil War was not. I want to jump forward and tell about a very stubborn man who insisted on speaking in the German language when people were forcing English upon him. It's the same man who we've heard about as the great entrepreneur, John Schrag. John lived 11 miles from here, where Harvey County Park is, where three creeks came together, and he was called John by the Creek, or Klickahannes. In World War I, when Mennonites were supposed to stop speaking German and buy war bonds and contribute in other ways, he refused to buy war bonds. The result of that was that on Armistice Day, the end of the war, where they were having a celebration in Burton, a group of people came out to his farm, captured him, took him to the town of Burton, and said, you buy bonds now or face the consequences, and he refused. They said, you're going to lead at the head of a parade, you're going to carry a flag, and he said, no, everything he said, he was saying in German. They thrust a flag into his hand. He didn't grab it, the flag fell down. Somebody said he stepped on the American flag, and the mob became a crazy group, and they decided to hang him. They got a rope from the hardware store. The stores had been closed for the day, for the celebration. And they got some yellow paint and smeared it onto it, rubbed it into his beard so that he looked like, according to the paper, a squash at the autumnal ripening. They were going to hang him to a tree there when Tom Roberts, the head of the Burton Anti-Horse Thief Association, who had a gun and believed in law and order, stepped between John Schrag and the group and said, "You're not going to kill this man unless over my dead body, because America is a country of law and order. And we'll give him a trial if he's to be killed." They got him, Tom Roberts got him into the little jail on Main Street there in Burton, and allowed people to walk past and spit at him through the window and curse him and so on. Called the head of the, called to Newton, to the county jail, county courthouse. They came out and got him overnight, or so that he could be cleaned up and released that evening. I heard about this. The most extended account that I heard about this some years ago, 1968, was an interview with a member of the mob who used about the same language that I've used. He said, we made plans to come back later that evening, that night, when it wouldn't be, we'd overwhelm the guards and we would kill him. But he was gone, so we weren't able to do that. But he said, I began to think about that, and I realized what had happened, and I realized who this Schrag was. He never fought back. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't defend himself in any way. They slap him and kick him, and he just was passive. As he was there, it seemed like a glow came over his head, like those pictures you see of Jesus on people's walls. You mean Solomon's head of Christ? He said, well, yeah, probably that one. And he told me, you know, as a result of that, I became a non-resistant Christian. I said, you became a Mennonite? No, I joined the Assemblies of God. You can be a non-resistant Christian and belong to the Assemblies. This is John Schrag. The Newton Kansan, well, the Burton citizens, not satisfied, decided to take John Schrag to court for violating the Espionage Act, for insulting the American flag. In court, they had 50 pages of testimony from citizens of Burton. In court, John Schrag, it was general agreement. Everything he said in German. None of the people who were testifying against him could understand German. The judge threw out the testimony. The Newton Kansan said, the acquittal of this bull-headed man suggests that the case should certainly make plain to any thinking person the viciousness that exists in the encouragement of the German language as a means of communication in America. Well, we traded Americanization for Russianization. It's important to note that John Schrag was not killed, that he was defended, that there were people who believed in law and order who risked their lives in his behalf, that even though 2 churches were burned in America, not Swissville Indian churches, and even though there were more than a dozen mob action against the Mennonites, this may have been one of the more dramatic of them, we can't finally second guess. We still don't know whether it's better to pray to God in English or in Russian.
Robert Cradle was born in Pretty Prairie, is a lawyer, and served some years as Kansas state legislator. Robert?
V. Gates. The correct response to that is sehr gut. The German song reminded me of the only 4 German words that I learned at the University of Kansas, and I probably shouldn't admit this in public, but we had to take 16 hours of German at the university to get a bachelor's degree, and I thought, since I grew up in the same yard with a German-speaking lady, that I could probably do pretty well in German. It was the only D I ever got in my entire educational career. It was a serious embarrassment, but I do remember V. Gates and sehr gut. So, You know, there's times too when you bump up, as we look at assimilation of Swiss Millennium Mennonites into the greater culture, which is America, that you bump up against yourself of who you really are. And I started having those experiences when I went to the University of Kansas, and I can still remember. And what brought this to mind was the plowing going on out there in the field today. It brought to mind my experience in history class there, my first year there. One of the major developments in agriculture was the invention of the moldboard plow. And the teacher in the class that day said, "How many of you know what a moldboard is?" And of course I sat there knowing the answer, but afraid to raise my hand, and I was waiting for somebody else to raise their hand and answer the question, and nobody raised their hand. And I realized that I'm sitting in the middle of a bunch of wealthy Johnson County, Kansas City urban people. And I realized who I was. I was the only farmer in that room. So I raised my hand. I got my courage up and I raised my hand. And the teacher said, "Okay, what's moldboard?" I said, "Oh, that's the part of the plow that tips the soil over when you pull it through the ground. That's a plow." And he said, "That's exactly right. Where are you from?" And I told him I'm from Pretty Prairie, Kansas. He said, "You're a Mennonite farmer, aren't you?" I said, "There are times when you bump up against who you are and you have to publicly admit it." So I thought Harley posed an interesting query about $2 invested in the stock market compared to $2 invested in this quarter section, which appears to be corn right now today. And I expect that in both scenarios you would have been alternately very wealthy and very broke, probably at least 6 or 10 times in the last 125 years. But at least with $2 invested in that corn, you still have corn to eat, Harley, so it might have been a pretty wise choice. So I don't know. I was going to talk briefly in the context of this celebration, the theme of this celebration of prairie people, world people, about our assimilation into the American culture, and particularly about the only part of it that I know anything about, which is the last 50 years, and I guess I would title my speech the Swiss Millennium Baby Boomers. As we look at our history, and we go back 125 years to immigration into America, you know, we came over in groups. And let me just stop and put myself into context for those of you who probably don't know who I am. My dad is right here. Ralph L. Crable is my dad, and he's the person who should be up here giving this speech. And my mother is over here, Leona Weedle. We're all cousins. We're all related probably in this room. We're all cousins. And of course, my grandfather was D.J. Crable. And my great-grandfather was John D. Crable, and he was married to Carrie Crable. And John Crable came over in 1874 on the ship. And I didn't know him because he had died fairly young. But I lived in the same yard with the German-speaking lady, which I mentioned earlier, who was Carrie Crable. And all of these people I owe a great deal to. We were a very wealthy family. We didn't have any money, but we had everything that money couldn't buy. And I will be forever grateful for that heritage. It was the best upbringing that a child could ever have. So that's kind of the context of who I am. And when I look back 125 years to the immigrants and John D. Crable who came over, to just kind of take a look at what the world was like at that time, you realize that America, even in 1874, there's quite a bit of history already happened in the U.S. But we arrived just shortly after the end of the Civil War. And shortly thereafter, General George Armstrong Custer was killed at the Little Bighorn. And that was after my great-grandfather had arrived in South Dakota. And it was about 1890 when the chief Sitting Bull finally died, and the rest of the Sioux tribe was herded onto a reservation. And of course you had the massacre of the Indians at Wounded Knee in 1890. So we were at a period of time there when the frontier was developing, but it was still a very violent kind of America. And so there were many threats out there. And so people still moved in groups, as I'm sure they did in Russia, basically for survival purposes, and it was very necessary to maintain the integrity of that group. But as the world changed, and changed very rapidly, we had to explore again the boundaries that kept those groups together. We put boundaries around us. We had specific boundaries. We had ethnic boundaries. We had religious boundaries. We had racial boundaries. We had political boundaries, and we had intellectual boundaries. And we didn't really cross those lines. And what I'm talking about when I talk about boundaries is, for example, the ethnic and religious boundaries. You didn't marry, for example, outside of the church, a religious boundary. You didn't marry an English girl. You didn't cross those kinds of boundaries. And in my family, we had some people who crossed those boundaries. My great-grandfather's brother, for example, crossed the boundary, married an English girl, and was kicked out of the church. I had a great-uncle, V. John Crable, who went to the University of Kansas, got an education, which was something that was pretty rare at the time, and did very well. And the story was told to me that someone asked his mother, my great-grandmother, aren't you proud of how successful Johnny has become? And she said, oh, Johnny, oh my no, he's too much with the outsiders, she said. So he had crossed the boundary. And as the world changed, the need to keep the group together for economic reasons, for survival reasons that existed in the frontier, those kinds of needs changed somewhat. And at that point in time, too, many of us, baby boomers, could no longer farm. Perhaps we would all like to farm, but economics really forced us out of that group and into the greater world. So as you go off to schools and different universities and get away from parochial schools and whatnot, you constantly are bumping up against those boundaries, and you're forced to define who you are. And I crossed just about all of those boundaries at one time or another, and it's a dangerous journey. But I can tell you the fundamental concepts which underlie the faith of this group, the faith of the Swiss Valenian Mennonite people, could not provide a better foundation for people to take those journeys, because you always carry with you the fundamental knowledge that above all else is family, the strength of your history, and the strength of the Swiss Valenian people. And it's certainly an honor and a privilege for me to return after many journeys to the Swiss Valenian culture. And I've learned so much from the gentlemen that I've had the opportunity to serve here with, and from returning here today, and it's certainly a privilege to be part of this. Is that my 5 minutes, Greg?
First, one could assume that the statement was made in all seriousness, an authentic expression of fear and hostility. In this case, the story would stand as an awesome warning in this modern world of ethnic cleansing, of the dark side of ethnic celebration, of the costs of what Dave and Nita Jackson call wrong remembering, lifting one's own people up by putting others down. I suspect all of us here today would find that interpretation of the story more than a tad melodramatic. Even if, as E.G. himself claimed, the Schweitzers who attended Bethel College with him would throw in the creek any of their number who dated a Low German girl, that's such a far cry from the atrocities of Kosovar Serbs and Albanians that the comparison is at least absurd, if not obscene. I agree totally. But I do think there is a less vicious kind of fear and mistrust that may be reflected in the story. And in light of subsequent history, it too seems absolutely absurd. Those of us who went to grade school and high school and college with the Philistine learned quickly enough that they were much more like us than they were different from us. And I suspect it would behoove all of us to remember and acknowledge again the absurdity of the statement in this present moment, when those of us who are Mennonite are being asked to integrate with others of different skin color and different worship style and different theological shadings. Let's not raise the "Das sind die Philistern" cry once again. A third interpretation of the story is one that Jim Yankee and Ed G. Kaufman himself, in his recollections preserved at the Mennonite Library and Archives at Bethel College, have offered. And that is that the statement was never anything more than a joke. No one ever took it seriously. It was simply a creative attempt to get a good laugh. Now, I have always believed that one of the gifts of the Swiss Valenians was a unique sense of humor. My own mother-in-law, who is as Low German as they come, has more than once commented on the fact that the Moundridge folks evidence a much better sense of humor than the Low Germans in her home community. So this one ought to be an unqualified positive, right? Chalk one up for the Schweitzers. Maybe. My friend George Rogers once complained that it is very hard to get a straight answer from a Mennonite. You'll generally get an indirect answer, often in an apparent attempt to be humorous. George didn't distinguish between Schweitzers and Low Germans in that assessment, but I'm guessing that it's more of a Schweitzer thing. Ed G. Kaufman suggested on more than one occasion that it may have been fueled by a sense of inferiority, at least vis-a-vis the Low Germans. And I wonder if it's at all related to another and very troubling comment once made by a now retired faculty member at Bethel College. Mennonites, he said, are some of the most passive-aggressive people I have ever met. I hope that's not accurate. But could it be true that we have a tendency to use humor as an instrument of passive-aggressive behavior? After all, it's a great way to have it both ways. We can call the Low Germans Philistines and then assure them and ourselves that we were just kidding. What I treasure most from this heritage of mine is a unique understanding of Christian discipleship. I think that as Mennonite Christians, we are called to be instruments of healing and hope in a world desperately in need of both. I leave you with this question. Is it possible that part of being such persons is to make sure that our yes means yes and our no means no? That our humor is truly funny and our critiques are direct and open and honest. Thank you.
In the Mennonite